So Walley told me that he never responds to people putting you down on alt fan Frank Zappa. On that, he gets their address and privately communicates to them and says, "Wait a minute, you got it all wrong." And then he tells them about you, and then they go by, these kids or whatever they are, email back, "Gee, Dave Walley emailed me," and they're all inflated because he even contacted them. But then they got to deal with what he said, which is you. So is that what you mean, that you're getting wackos sent to you?
It fell out.
When was is that now?
I don't know. He sent me.
Yeah, I would say that's when was that? You know, the kid. That's the midgets.
Notice what had fallen out of the book.
That's very recent.
Oh, it says summer '95. Yeah, a year ago, because they were about 4 this summer, and this is a year ago. Frank Zappa.
Yeah, I know. He does sort of look like Frank.
When we okay. Anyway, I told you about driving around with him, and,
right.
but and how he looked like Frank. And the neat thing is, Jelly is his wife. Jelly is a name on Civilization Phase 3, one of the original people on the piano, which is a variation of Gail.
Somebody else's, yeah, that's what that was kind of strange.
Did you notice that? Yeah. So anyway, so you're getting wackos because those are people that Walley has privately gone to and said, "You should talk to Nigey and change your view," kind of thing.
Right. And so they do crawl out of the woodwork for it. It's so okay though. He's
so that's where they come from. When he told me he does, he privately does it. Nobody knows on Alt Fan Frank Zappa this is happening. You know what I mean?
Right.
So. The first question is,
what time is it?
Page 22.
Well, you know what? Have you seen that video? What Frank does? It's really neat.
But I can believe it.
He has the dummy Frank Zappa go. What do you really want to know? He's a journalist. He's like a 40s stupid reporter hat. You know,
press.
Press thing. And Frank goes like this. He's there smoking. He goes, "What time is it?" He asks somebody off screen, you know, and it's beautiful the way he does it. It's like, that's a ridiculous question. What time is it? Can I get out of this interview? It's one way. Right. But metaphysically, out of context, it's what time is it? But he's turning off to the side, going, "What time is it?" It was beautiful the way he, really good acting that, he didn't go, "Well, the main question, what time is it?" He acted it out. He went, "What time is it?" Which had the funny thing is, that's such a serious question, let's get out of here. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that's the way it looks. So what I want to ask, well, the first thing that comes is, what did Frank, if you got any memories of Frank talking about Rumpelstiltskin or the dwarf metaphor or the dwarf image? You ever hear him talk about dwarfs or fairy tale?
Come on in.
Oh, this is mine?
Hello.
Hello. You want to be in our movie?
Oh, no, you guys go ahead.
Pull up a chair. No, you should enjoy the
I'm Monty. How are you?
Monty.
Monty.
Yes. What do you call him?
Hi, Monty.
Hi, how are
I had a
you?
conversation with Frank about dwarfs or mythical things, because he said that his house was Rumpelstiltskin decor. He said that later.
Yeah. I mean, it's I don't ever remember him saying anything to me specifically about dwarves, except that I do remember him referring to smallness in a lot of ways. Smallness. Things that are,
like Toads of the Short Forest.
Yeah, Toads of the Short Forest, or he had a real funny fixation on dwarf anything, and we can get very Freudian about it, but we won't.
But he never said that. You're saying that to me.
Yeah, that's my sort of.
But the thing is that he, not that we have to analyze it, but just that he did talk about small things.
That Frank loved. The smaller it was, the better he liked it.
Which relates to him and Preston.
The
the biological films they'd show in their jazz things in '62 or whatever, they would show microscopic light.
Literally, slides.
So that's paramecium. What is it, Jerry? The Hammond organ or something?
Yeah, dwarf nebula.
Oh yeah, that's there, but the smallness is in
the one-celled microorganism. Hammond microorganism.
One-celled organism. Yeah. Right. So there is the conceptual continuity of smallness. Yeah. Well, that's interesting.
And I always
now, guys, if you're having trouble following this because it's on a much higher level than any of you.
That's God.
Right,
you're following. This is all old hat to God over
God's
there.
bored. In fact, he's sitting over there.
God's always bored.
He's sitting over there on his maroon sofa with his cigar.
The maroon sofa, right? So the.
I'm the old fuck from the New Testament.
How about King Kong and bigness? You ever
that was the other side of it, wasn't it? Yeah.
Did he say anything about bigness?
Well, just in terms of maybe looking at stuff as a microstructure and a macrostructure in his world, and he had to have, I think, archetypes. that would present that.
He talks about archetypes. I only
Yeah.
see him use that word in reference to
Well, he never
Reuben the Jets.
used that term. But
He
what
did
I'm
in an interview with Miles about Reuben the Jets.
Yeah, that's right.
R&B archetypes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But what I'm thinking is, if you look at the way he handled his subject matter, he was always using little parables or little stories.
Yeah. Like
to
Uncle
get his-
Remus or the
yeah,
whole...
well, the whole, or I mean, like the Cletus Aretus thing.
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
a parable. I mean, that was like he was trying to, he was almost like an old Roman folk myth that never
Yeah.
existed, but bringing it in, So, I mean, if
To
you-
talk about the music industry.
Yeah, exactly. So if you want to extrapolate and just say, these were his ways of dealing with microstructure and macrostructure, those were the stories he would tell.
Right.
And who knows what part of his troubled psyche or his childhood or his adolescence all this stuff came out of, but it doesn't really matter.
So he never talked to you about King Kong as a macrostructure,
Mhm.
and you don't remember him talking about bigness. He talked about smallness.
Mhm.
That's what you remember.
Yeah, smallness I remember, and
Yeah.
just his attention to detail was the most, I think, if I had to single out one aspect of Frank that really struck me forcibly, was his attention to
To
detail.
detail.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Almost
like-
to the exclusion of everything else.
Right, and Tony Palmer, when he worked on 200 Motels,
Mhm,
said
mhm.
that working with Frank was like working with a yogi,
Mhm.
in the sense of his attention and discipline.
Yeah.
Okay, where's the book, Ben Watson's book? Do you have it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Did you bring that quote? I can remember, but you on page 431?
I didn't bring it.
Okay. If you ever see Ben's book, go to page 431. Actually, do you have the Don Men guitar player interview '92? The whole thing devoted
Yeah,
to
actually, I
Frank?
do. You might have to stop the camera for a
Yeah,
second.
let's get
but
that,
I
because
think
that is where it is.
on the track.
Mm.
There's a really strong image I found in both.
Was the same guy who made that documentary about my family?
Yeah.
Also made a
He was
movie years before about
with
Frank Zappa.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
200
About Tuna
Motels.
Motels,
Right.
which was sort of ironic. He would go from
It is, I know.
Well,
yeah
he's-
from
yeah,
from Zappa to Menuhin.
Probably a
Right.
gun. It's just gun for hire.
Yeah,
For sure.
Yeah.
Because I mean, the Royal Phil, the RSO or whatever, they're a hireable orchestra. They were.
Battery is the highest form of imitation. No,
Battery.
imitation's the highest form of battery.
Battery. Battery is the highest. I like
Was
that.
he, because of his attention to detail and his concern about micro, macro, was he ever concerned about questions of scale? Scale would be like if you were building
Mhm.
a model of a truck, you would
Mhm.
want it to be exactly, all the proportions would be just right, so that if you blew it up to full size, it would be a perfect model.
Oh,
of
sure.
it.
Well, he's more likely to be concerned with scale and penises and so on.
No, yeah, I think he definitely was. I mean, if he could have somehow, I think, put a ratio to everything, I think he would have done it. If you ever watched him working in the studio, trying to get certain sounds to, fit into a mix and sound exactly a certain way, he wanted it to sound like acoustically absolutely perfect, and he would just get into such detail about it that it was just almost insane, So sure, I think scale was a big focus of his work. And he wasn't interested only in the micro and the macro. There was a million shades in between, and he wanted to make sure the thing hit right in the place where he thought it should, as precise.
Well, it sounds like you have an understanding of what his mind was working on, but a little while ago you were kind of like, I don't know why, what was, like...
Well, there's stuff, what I've always said about Frank is, being around him at the point in time, which was primarily in 1971, 72 to a certain extent, and then there, also 73 and 74, 75, but the real intensive point at which I knew him was 71 and 72. And I can, speak quite, without even really thinking about it, in describing his mindset and my impressions of what he was like and how he thought at that point. If you ask me something, like, well, why did Frank, look at Bob and say such and such? Well, I wasn't there, and I don't really know, so I can't give you anything more than a general theory.
But what about, do you have a theory about why he was concerned about questions of scale, micro, macro, details, and so on?
Well, I have theories. I don't, proof on something like that is fairly difficult. If you really want to
What would be
nail
your
it down.
top 1 or 2 theories?
Theories? Why Frank was interested in scale? Frank had a mathematical mind that had not been trained in mathematics. And he tended, I think, to look at everything in a sense, in an abstract form as a mathematical problem that was in need of a mathematical solution. I think that came directly from his father, who was a mathematician of a certain type.
Wow.
And the structure of Frank's thought and the structure of his thinking, you know, his mind to a certain extent, was a lot like his father's. If you ever talk to the old guy and then talk to Frank, you could see immediately where that came from.
Okay, let's.
There's two issues, Bob, so maybe that's not the right one. But you just.
Oh yeah, no, this isn't the one.
Yeah, there's two.
It's got most of the same interviews in.
Well, they redid it.
Yeah.
There's two different issues, but
Okay.
you know what you're talking about.
I didn't know you turned the tape on, but the very beginning, I knew the tape was on after a while, but what was when you started talking about Frank, what was the opening thing in this section?
The dwarf, and then you were
No, wait, when I'm looking at this, and what were you saying about...
Scott asked about his
scale.
Scale.
What was said just before that? That's what I...
What was said just before that? I don't know.
Talking about the
We were just talking about Tony Palmer.
And what
Yeah.
time, before that it was what time it is.
No, you came back, I'm starting the magazine, and you started talking about Frank. And I hadn't said anything, but somebody asked you something.
We were talking about Tony
Scott.
Palmer, then Scott asked about scale.
Just before, but you were saying something about scale before he asked it, because...
Well, just, you know, the micro and the macro.
What'd you
He
say
was
about-
talking. She was talking about how Tony Palmer's documentary
orchestra.
and the
Oh,
orchestra.
yeah. What is it? Just since I didn't... You're saying there was a similarity between Menuhin's orchestra idea?
Well, there was just, you know, I think it was Tony Palmer's concept. You know, he got it, you know, looking at Frank. And
Oh,
Frank's
you mean you're
approach.
saying the documentary was similar to a Frank
There was
organizational
a
thing?
thought that ran through both of them. Where it came from, I'm not positive, you know, but Palmer was showing the orchestra as this large-scale organism made up of many cells.
Oh, yeah.
And it had a mind of its own, but not enough of a mind to control itself. And the conductor, therefore, is necessary. And I think, in a sense, there was a real control metaphor in both 200 Motels and the Menuhin documentary.
Yeah, so you're saying that you just see that's where it slid from just talking about Lionel and his book, and then you started talking, but you were adapting to
Well,
Frank's
since we
saying.
had the voice of God over here, I thought
Yeah.
let's tie the two together.
Right, and then you started the tape right at that point. So you're saying that you noticed, you just brought in the point that Tony's compositional pattern might have been influenced by Frank, is what you're saying.
In some
the
sense,
cells
yeah,
thing.
just unconsciously, I'm sure. But
Okay, well you brought up, I can't find the Synclavier quote, and
what was the gist of it? Maybe
I think that you may not know anything about it since it was about the Synclavier days and you weren't with him.
No, I wasn't
But-
there, but I mean.
But it's about working, you were right to say there's a macro and the micro, and he was attentive to the phases in between. He talks about the G dust.
Oh yeah.
You know, you read
yeah,
some of that.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and how he is interested in
dust,
the XPL secret programming
Mhm.
that organizes the Synclavier program
Sure.
that you're working
It's
with.
a sub- it's a
And they worked their way to get in behind the scenes,
Mhm.
sort of like the computer brain police,
Yeah.
and
He wanted to
musical
seize
line-
the means of control,
Yeah.
literally go past it. Yeah.
which is always metaphorical of what he wanted to do.
Mhm.
Because we had a great dialogue with Van Carlson, his cameraman, and he told the story about when Frank got the opportunity to use Moscow's satellite, and for 450, a huge situation, and they were going to make Frank create his TV show up there as ZNN to fight CNN. But anyways, that's his political motive there. And okay, so
That's pretty macro.
yeah, that's
That would be-
okay.
yeah.
That's an okay. Now so you're talking about so in the Frank is in the interval. In the computer terms, the G dust is this interval thing, and he talked about the intervals and these secret instructions in
Right.
the interval, and he called it the dust zone.
How virtually every note that the instrument was capable of playing had a frequency that was spelled out in certain computer
Right.
notation.
And that's what he was
And
looking
that was
at.
what he was trying to work with directly in composing that piece.
Which fits into some of my ideas in my article on Frank, and in the interview in '88 he talks about Pauline Oliveri's idea of above and below.
Right.
And that's a common theme. I don't want to talk about my ideas. What I want to do is give you bizarre theories and see what experiences which you may not if you had with them, but you never thought of before, that we want some evidence of something here. So you went right into it about his father. Jerry and I made a breakthrough last week. Jerry has this. You remember he was in Life magazine in '71.
Well, there's
With
folks.
folks, yeah.
Okay.
Well, they interviewed the father,
Mhm.
and they never published it, but Jerry coincidentally got a copy of the Life magazine interview with the father. It's a long interview.
It's the whole transcript.
Yeah, it's really interesting how the father talks about Frank. In Walley's book, he basically got the impression talking to Frank's father that he was very proud of Frank and all this stuff. But if you read that in detail, I create this idea that his father was the guy who worked for military intelligence and created Frank to do what he did, and the secret control behind Frank was his father. Now, that's an absurd notion, but when you read the interview, read the thing, you could fit that in there, and you just said that Frank had a mind like his father. Now, did you hear, what kind of talk about his father did you get from Frank?
Well, you know, what I saw, this was later when I was actually staying up there.
In 72, this is the next
Later,
year.
yeah.
When
Later.
Walley's book comes out and
Right.
you're aware of their paranoia about the
Right,
book.
boy was he ever. And I met his father on one occasion. I guess his father was ailing pretty badly.
Yeah, because he dies in
Yeah,
73,
he died
so.
the following year. And I guess he was up there to take care of some business. And I talked to his father for 20 minutes or half an hour. And that was the only exposure to the old
Yeah.
fellow that I ever had, but it was really enlightening because
Let's hear about it. Yeah, this is the evidence.
well, you know, his dad came in and sat down. He was waiting for Frank to get done with some stuff upstairs. He was going to come down and talk, you know, and I was down in the
You
basement.
mean, you're down in the basement, so he's
Right.
waiting to talk
Right.
to Frank in the
Yeah,
basement.
right.
Frank's upstairs,
Frank's
so he comes
upstairs,
down and waiting.
Right, and so I'm talking to his dad, and, you know, his dad, as probably, I'm sure, you know, Jerry, did you ever talk to his dad? Or did you
No.
meet his dad? No, it was before, well, maybe
Yeah.
before your time. Well, his dad was a very, he just, you know, he was a gregarious fellow. He was used to talking to people as a teacher,
Right.
and, you know, as a public figure to a certain extent. And
In his little town
yeah,
that
and
he
it's
lived
the way
in.
he, you know, the way he lived his life. And
Yeah.
he really talked a lot. He just loved to talk. You know, you didn't. Basically, what you did was sit there and nod and say, let him do all the, you know.
Yeah.
And that was fine because I didn't have specific questions I wanted to ask him. I just wanted to see what kind of a guy he was and, you know, how he talked about Frank. And the feeling that I got was he was very proud of Frank. I mean, you know, it's almost like
Almost
it's,
inordinately proud.
in the sense
Yeah.
that it's like, you know, well, I don't know what my life would have added up to, but I've had this famous son, and that's worth something.
Yeah.
And that was the distinct impression that I got.
And he, in this interview, talks about, he analyzes Frank exactly like Dave Walley does, in the sense, it's like, he says, this guy, everybody's misinterpreting him, he's going to be a great composer in the long run, they don't know that Frank has a big plan, and he was saying
He
exactly what
understood what
Frank
Frank was
was
trying to
saying,
do,
you know, and he was saying, laying it all out, and he was even making fun, he says, these people, they don't know what I know about Frank, okay, and all this stuff, and so you could read into it, because that this guy was the puppet master, because what's interesting is that Frank, in Toronto, I have this obscure article nobody has. In '69, he does an interview with Richie York, who was the pop journalist there in Toronto, where he describes Uncle Meat, and he does a whole different twist. Jerry might be able to supplement it. He doesn't think he has the article. I thought I gave it to him. But it's about, Uncle Meat is about a guy whose father works for the government. And and gets fired. It's the Uncle Meat scenario. He gets fired, but he's been involved in a very evil project, and he's pissed off to get fired, and he's going through this whole revenge thing of how to get back to the government. And the son, Frank talks about the son as a character, in my memory anyways. The son is aware of this, and the son is watching the father conspire this thing.
I think that's maybe the key to the whole thing, is Frank as a kid watching his father doing this stuff
Right.
for the government. And that was why he learned to mistrust the government.
Yeah. And now, so you see, Frank is a documentarian, is a journalist about his father's conspiracy against the government. And Uncle Meat, the father, creates this band, Reuben and the Jets. That's Frank Zappa and the Reuben and the Jets. Now, we figured this out the morning of our Tommy Mars dialogue. You know, we did Tommy Mars.
Yeah.
So we went through this whole thing about Frank and some ideas I had. Tommy, in his own experience, it was confirmed. What he said confirmed what my theories were, and he also could, like I'm trying to get from you. Oh yeah, that's why he said this. You know, and it came back, all these things. But it came to the point where I wasn't going to bring this up. It was just a new idea. But it came to the point where he started to say, you know, I always felt that Frank was, when we were his army, he was the general. He was like a general, and we were a guerrilla squad, an army, which is the Grand Wazoo booklet. And he said, I always felt that Frank was working for someone else, that somebody was pulling Frank. He said that, and I said, oh, there's the opening to bring this idea up. And so I don't know how much I went into it, but I said, well, who he was working for was his father. And he goes, that's right, and shook my hand. And we never, it was the end of the interview, I didn't want to go into it, because, but it was just amazing, and he said, right. Now what the hell is he talking, what is Tommy seeing there?
Well, I think, look, I mean, if you know, we're around Frank a lot, you can tell that his personality was formed by conflict with
The parents.
the parents.
Now the you know what the Life magazine guy said? He said, interviewing the parents and Frank, he said it was a bizarre experience. He says, he writes it out. He says, it's like they reverse roles. When I interviewed Frank, he talked like the parent about the renegade kids, which were his parents.
His folks, right.
And the parents were the little kids who were rebelling against something. And even the mother, who we've always been portrayed as a
The nice Italian lady.
brain dead
Right, kind of
mother.
watching roller derby.
Yeah, she's in the interview, and she's talking about Frank like her father, like her husband, about what a great guy. She's more perceptive. And so it's like Frank's trying to apologize for his wild parents, and the parents are celebrating the wild image they created through Frank. You know what I mean? Now that was funny. And you never would see that. It was this unpublished thing. So you could say that the way Mr. Zappa was, he says he was writing a book on gambling. He never knew anything about gambling, but he was doing it. And he was a mathematician, and he was
Calculating odds and probabilities.
historian. What?
His father, well, you know.
Probabilities, yeah.
Yeah, it's called chances and how to take them.
Right. And so we create this whole scenario that he created Frank as a probe into the pop culture. He took a risk. He was gambling. He was all this. He was a puppeteer. Now.
Oh, you mean that the Svengali was...
He's the Svengali. And because
well, you notice that they have the same name. It's almost.
Well, no,
like
they didn't, and that is part. He put. See here, that was the breakthrough. The cover on Lumpy Gravy is Francis Vincent Zappa.
Yeah.
And Frank is a little dwarf looking up at his dad. What do I do next?
Yeah.
Pretending I'm Rumpelstiltskin. You know what I mean? And the album's written by his father. the historians will make great. If you can confirm this, we put this into a time capsule in 200 years, they'll really be confused when they write the history of Frank and focus.
Yeah.
It's like Shakespeare's missing mistress that he wrote.
Why do you think that 200 years from now don't care about Zappa?
Oh, it's because he was a great musician, as well as a great composer. No, I think because, well, I'm going to be famous.
fighting words.
Yeah, Lionel, here's the reason why. Bob Dobbs, myself, says that because of Lockdown Bob Rule, I'm going to make Frank famous. Your great-grandchildren are going to have to study Frank's music because he predicted me. That's my...
No, that has more validity than the...
Oh, okay, good. Lionel supports that. Yeah. Frank is a means to an end. You know what I mean? So that's why... So Jerry, is there any ideas you get from our conversation about his father on forgetting about something in that interview?
So you're basically saying that
The TV point.
Oh, yeah, what was that? Frank decided that, I have in my chart, Frank is opposite McLuhan. And,
the anti-McLuhan.
well, it turns out they're simpatico. It's like the old version and the young version. But the actor they're manifesting is King Lear, because Frank said he was always older than everybody. He said he's like 42 years old. And he was...
He's always very, he's always really
older.
conscious of that.
Yeah. Now, and that's why the Life magazine guy said, the son is the father, talking about his stupid kid parents. And so Frank said he saw his parents were screwing up their life. This is in this interview. He's quite open about it. I don't know if he ever said it anywhere else. He says they obviously they had a certain comfortable life, but he said, I don't want to go that way. So he said, I studied them. I studied them for a long time, what was wrong in his family, because he probably was impressed with his father. So why was his father making some Achilles heel? What was the Achilles heel? And he said, after a while, I concluded it was TV. He took the McLuhan view. TV was screwing up his parents. And he said, I studied
it
it.
Screwed up a whole generation.
Oh, yeah, right. That's where it becomes McLuhan. But he took it, he analyzed, he's just a guy.
McLuhan liked it, right?
No. Marshall didn't have a view. There was the services of TV and the disservices. And he was doing an inventory of both. He never liked it. TV had services, but if you had TV on as an environment too long, and he advocated turning it off every while, it would flip and create a directed society.
I have a friend who founded the Television Academy, and he founded it literally to be an academy where the president of the network would come and argue with the cameraman about what television
future
should be.
television.
And of course, needless to say, a year after he
Yes,
created
what?
it, it was taken from him and they created the Emmys and it became in essence a Chamber of Commerce.
Really?
But it
Yeah,
was
we wrote-
originally,
we wrote a book with him.
yeah, we were hard and he's going to be.
What's his name?
Sid Cassidy.
Sid Cassidy.
He's pretty old now and he's. You know.
So, anyways, so you guys were involved in media ecology in a certain level. Media ecology journey.
I was always
TV.
dubious
I
about
never
your friend
watched
McLuhan.
Oh, but you don't know anything about him. He was the one who wanted to turn off TV. But here's the point. TV is a synesthetic experience, tactility, which was good to get people out of their print bias or their movie bias, previous cultural hypnotism.
I like
But-
that bias.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah, Marshall was a print bias guy too, but he was talking technically. And he said, we are going to destroy all the values that we think we're preserving if we let TV run amok indefinitely. So we turn it off after a while, then we reuse other media to rebalance our media diet and our sensory life, and then we can actually wake up books again. Then when that becomes too extreme, you turn TV back on, and so basically put LSD in the population for a while, and then that rebalances their sensory life. So that's media ecology. And it's all laid out in this Playboy interview where he talks about using a global thermostat, using the computer as a global thermostat so that when you got too much TV in Venezuela, you turn it off and you put radio into it.
Why do you think Frank was so down on drugs?
This may relate to this, yeah. So he's described, Frank is saying, I studied what was happening with my kids, you know, which are his parents. He says, I decided TV was the root cause, which is an avant-garde perception by a young kid. I mean, he's only 17 or something. He's coming up with the McLuhan ideas. McLuhan said the same thing. The TV was causing these disservices. So he said,
That was, I mean, I was raised, I was a television, there was never television in my house anyway.
yeah, you're before that, you're radio.
And it was, no, it was just, there will be no television in this house.
Oh, you mean in your own life once you're an adult?
Yeah, the only first, I didn't see television until I went to other people's houses.
Yeah, no, TV was around when Lionel was a kid.
Oh, yeah,
but
definitely was
his
around.
parents refused, his mother refused to let it. in
Well,
the
that's
house.
exactly
She said she would walk out of a marriage the minute television
TV
ended.
came in.
Who said that?
My mom.
Right. Now here's my mother said something to my father eventually, but she eventually succumbed when they got real old. But that's exactly McLuhan's attitude. He was the last guy to get a TV in the neighborhood. He hated TV. He didn't want it in the house. But the real clue is his son, who's an expert on his father's work. I visited him in '78, and he had no TV. And his kids were like 4 and 5 and 6 or something. And I said, you don't have TV? He said, no. He says, up there in the attic, locked away. And he says, we're not going to have any TV in this house for years because I want to get to know my children. We want to have a family first. So that's a guy, you're a McLuhanite. You know, this is the point. And his son was using his father's knowledge and not bringing it into the family. But that's not the popular image of McLuhan. Nobody knows what McLuhan. He's like Zappa. It's so much like Zappa. They don't know what he's about. So anyway, so Frank decides TV's the thing, and it's pretty perceptive. So he decides never to deal with TV. But then in the interview, his father has a totally different, more aware attitude about TV than Frank is aware of. Isn't that right? There's something in there where his father's more aware. He says, he was actually like what Frank became, a guy who watched TV and C-SPAN.
Yeah, boy, yeah.
Mr. Zappa's going, I watch TV to study society, blah, 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 blah. You know, he was doing McLuhan, but he kept watching it. And
Which is what Frank did when the last 20 years of his life
Right.
is watch
Yeah.
CNN. He says, I don't have to go outside the house. I have it on TV.
his reality is his music and TV.
And it was funny because it struck me on the tour in '71 that for somebody who didn't particularly like TV and was vociferous about that, he was always watching it.
That's right.
It was always on.
But he was watching. Now he had learned.
But
He had learned what his father was doing.
Right.
He had become his father. That to watch it, and so you see this intelligence through his father, and Frank misinterpreted it.
Remember in the script for Captain Beefheart and the Grunt People, how the Beefheart character had the watch-all room?
The watch-all room.
It
Yeah.
was just like it was like a TV kind
Yeah.
of situation, but he could see everything. It was 360.
Oh, now you're getting into the next big idea. Okay, which would be relevant to you as a musician. So we leave this hanging. There's a great metaphor in Frank's father. Frank becomes his father, and his father was a very smart guy. And if Tommy Maris thinks that Frank was working for somebody, subconsciously or technically, It was in the conspiracy world. It's the Cowboys versus the Yankees. So the California Bohemian Grove guys wanted something from Frank, or his father wanted to infiltrate the Bohemian Grove guys and use Frank to go in there to do it.
Well, his father, I think, wanted legitimacy in the United States. Maybe he wanted
His own. He wanted to arrive because he had a megalomaniac view of his mind. He was he produced a great son.
He gave you that.
He was a cultured guy, and Frank always talked about his arguments with his father. His father said, "You've got to appreciate Shakespeare." And Frank wouldn't.
Yeah.
Did you get any?
Yeah, I remember hearing him talk about that. Actually, yeah.
To you?
Just in passing, making comments about how he'd argue with his father, but he didn't want to read anything. And his father says, "No, you got to read these books. They may bore you, but you've got to read them."
He was programming him as a little.
The father was 100% right.
Well, he was, but with Frank, I think it didn't really matter. He had the kind of original mind. He didn't necessarily need to go the same route as anybody else.
That's right. I agree with that.
Going his own way.
Books were irrelevant because Phineas Wake did it. See, my theory is that Phineas Wake was the last great composition. It was done. So you redo Phineas Wake with the new medium, which was the electric.
1939, I think.
39 it came out.
Yeah.
So my essay. Have you read Up the Orphic Ante? You haven't read my two Zappa articles, which, if you want to stick it in your book, is what they were written for that. They're in Flipside.
Yeah.
Anyways, the thing is, the thesis, I explain why Phineas Wake is the last word in all arts. He unifies art, science, and nature.
Well, how about Malcolm Lowry?
No. See, Phineas Wake is not just a book; it includes all media. Marshall just rewrote Phineas Wake. His great book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, which won the Governor General's Award, the subtitle was The Road to Phineas Wake, but that was never put in there. Phineas Wake is all that Marshall was rewriting. Now, I say Frank was the...
But what I'm saying is you're dismissing like Malcolm Lowry, who came just low after his words.
Well, he wrote books. Phineas Wake is not a book. Phineas Wake is all media. It's a movie. It's a TV set.
Maybe that's why I have trouble with it.
Yeah, you got to know the mixed media, the multimodal media thing. And so what I say, Frank. So.
Well, it was the same with Frank, because Frank worked that way. He worked in a multidimensionality. Yeah, I can see that. And I always felt that knowing Frank as I did, I always felt that ordinary music, ordinary writing, ordinary films, all of that stuff was all too one-dimensional for him.
Right. What do you mean by ordinary? Beethoven?
No, not ordinary, but just anybody who kind of was working in one
field,
dimension.
Yeah, one medium.
See, I don't think Bartok needed to work in anything other than what he did.
No, and
very good, Nigey. Nigey's getting ready for the initiation here. You're leading. You're filling. Keep going.
No. Sure. Bartok was a great composer, but he was essentially a composer. Frank worked on all kinds of simultaneous.
He wasn't just a musician. He was Tommy Murray. Totally.
Yeah.
That's what blew Tommy Races. You're the first to say that. That's true. He was not a musician.
But Bartok didn't have all the other media to work with.
That's right.
Frank.
It was
a new media environment.
Well, I think Bartok would have still been a composer.
The thing that struck me too is when we were listening to music together, Frank would, he pointed out about Perez. He said the poor guy, he had to give up composing for a long time. In fact, he never really got back to it because the technology didn't exist to enable him to do
for his ideas.
And Frank, boy, I saw an identification there because he felt the same way. There was no medium all-encompassing enough for him to be able to put it all in one place.
What he wanted to do.
Did you ever see him in a live show? He did this right at the end of a few shows that I remember specifically. He'd be winding, the band would have this gigantic, kind of crescendo, boom, 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 and go on a certain number of bars. Frank would wind, like doing his conductor routine, and he would wind it all up like this, and wind it all up like that, and wind it all up, and break it down smaller and smaller and smaller, so it was like a little shape like this.
Right.
Boom!
Yeah.
You ever see him do that?
Yeah, many times.
That describes his work, I think,
as
much as anything. He's trying to get it up here, down there.
That's the macro micro. Yeah. But he made it small in the end, and then it was a little
just
ball.
Just for a second, it's this little, we're getting back to this little thing, but this little thing,
That's right.
And I think he didn't appreciate that at all, that he had to do that with his work. He would have liked to have kept it out there where he could perceive all of it.
Well, that was, all his albums are the Baroque spirals, that spiraled out.
There was a description, Ian Underwood had a description of Overnight Sensation when it was mixed down. He said, shit, this does not sound at all like we sounded doing this. It's like looking at the band through the wrong end of a telescope. Yeah. And that, unfortunately, did happen with a lot of Frank's work.
And that's because Frank was working with ideas.
And details. You can't let focus on details to the exclusion of all else. You have to have the big picture in mind all the time. And in a sense, it was almost like with Frank, the big picture was so big that when he did start to focus on the details, he lost the big picture.
Yeah.
It was hard to hold.
Hey, Henry Miller likes Frank. Frank, F-R-A-N-C-K.
There's a whole there's an interesting essay, though, in the Air Conditioned Nightmare It's
Yeah.
called With Edgar Varese in the Gobi Desert.
Hmm.
It's
You know,
really-
I
it's a
met through
piece.
Wall, you know, Don Gifford, the Joyce
Yeah.
scholar.
Yeah, he's always talking.
He's a
about
Vrez, he hung out with Vrez as a
Yeah.
kid, as a student.
Yeah.
But this thing, and you just said, talking about the, okay, down the ball. He used to, didn't he go, Jerry, he'd make a little geometric design
Yeah,
before he took the
drawing
ball, and then he'd
designs.
kick it out to the audience.
Yeah, I saw him do that.
Yeah, but you were,
Yeah.
what was the last words you were just saying, just, you,
There's
that
something
he-
about bringing it
he
all
couldn't make
together.
it, oh, then,
Yeah,
then,
it was so
okay.
all-encompassing, yeah.
So here's the thing, this is,
But I always wondered why
oh,
he
he's
took
not a musician, music was a tiny little cell of dealing with
what he did.
mixed media.
Mhm.
All the, now, this proves that he was redoing Finnegan's Wake.
Mhm.
Because Finnegan's Wake is a movie, it's all media. And
Mhm.
he's got lines in
Well,
there.
listen, no,
Oh,
it's-
I just remember, okay, let me say this.
Yeah.
Did you read the interview with the dead Frank?
Yeah.
Okay,
Sure.
you remember Michael Blake Reed, the medium, who's asleep,
Mhm.
and the evergreens and Frank speak through him, and he's not aware. When he came out of it, he gives his impressions, and what does he say? He says, he's channeled many people before, but he's never got inside their skull.
Mhm.
Whatever that ghost of Frank is that he got
What's-
into,
what's left.
he got inside, and he said, I was amazed at the huge head that he had, and the
Yeah.
immense projects that Frank wanted to do. So he confirms it, and then he says in his dreams that I asked Frank, why didn't you change your name so you didn't have to
Oh, so
stay,
you can put out other stuff.
put out stuff, do other
Yeah.
things under a different identity that you wouldn't have a stigma.
Well, I
And
don't
Frank
think-
says, yeah, I should have done that.
I don't, maybe it wasn't that so much as just there wasn't any way, because we tend to perceive things in one dimension, and Frank didn't. That was what was so strange about him, is like some people...
Not a musician, that's what you're meaning. He was an infiltrator.
Yeah, well...
Okay, carry on.
But no, I was going to ask you a question though. But it was just interesting that I think his problem was being forced to think in one dimension. It's like a person who can see suddenly having their vision taken away. They're trying to grow
They
around to
Live.
find-
He was fucking Dave, the
Yeah.
movie They
They
Live.
Live,
He did the
right.
sunglasses, and he
The
saw.
aliens
Yeah, he
saw
saw
it.
everything.
It's a
didn't
great movie. I love
Yeah,
that movie.
right, and he saw it, and then he tried to express it.
Yeah, and everybody thought he was fucking crazy.
Yeah. They Live.
But he never answered why Frank was anti-drug.
He never answered.
No, you didn't
Oh, well,
answer.
we'll eventually
Okay.
remember that.
But I wanted to, there's something
Yeah.
that crossed my mind, and that is, if I can be totally wrong with this because I'm not that, knowledgeable about Finnegan's Wake, but I've heard, I think maybe in your group, even Jerry, that Finnegan's Wake is a man who goes to sleep and has a dream.
Yes,
Is that correct?
that's a very simple.
Frank said something to me once that was really interesting.
That's in that article.
asked him,
The
but-
guy has a dream.
Yeah.
The government scientist. That's part of
Well,
it.
that was part of it, but I
Yeah.
asked Frank once, I said, what do you dream about at night? Because I was getting the sense of this dimensionality going on all the time, and I thought, when he sleeps, what's different? And
He was already dreaming awake.
Well, he said, I live in my dream.
Ooh.
Yeah.
And he said that in Wally's book, I create an environment, or I'm dealing with an environment hostile to
to
dreamers.
dreamers. See, and when he says, I live in my dream, well, obviously the world was hostile to him, and he
Yeah.
felt that, yeah.
So you said, you knew that he lived his dream. So what do you do when you dream?
What do you do when you're asleep?
Sleep. Yeah.
He says, well, I live in my dream, which is to say, I don't
sleep.
Sleep wasn't, really the issue.
He maybe didn't dream much
Yeah.
because he said he loved
Right.
sleeping
Right.
in the
Right.
meditation.
But that was probably a
stuff.
blank,
Right, that's what he liked
Just
going
so-
die. He
yeah.
died, and then he'd wake up with energy for the
Right.
next
It's-
period.
It's like the whole Zen concept. And everything,
Right.
you know.
So now you take Finnegan's Wake in my first article. I say Finnegan's Wake is in the shape of the prophecy that fission precedes fusion. And then I go on to say that he predicted the fusion of television and tried to manifest the television effect. And then after that is the satellite environment. And McLuhan worked from the satellite environment. And the satellite is the first time humanity could create a technology that he could live in. So he actually reproduced nature. So it was a successful extension of not the eye, ear, or the central nervous system, which was TV. It was an extension of the whole planet, which is what we call first nature, and technologies are second nature, that man repeats or tries to remake.
In a sense, art kind of fits that. too.
Art is
Sure.
man making stuff. So
Yeah.
all technologies are art, and the satellite is the ultimate art form because it merges first and second nature. Okay, so then the concept is that I then said that Marshall was, Baudrillard, the postmodernist Baudrillard?
Sure.
Yeah, he did an interview recently about McLuhan, and he said, well, I've always considered McLuhan a musician. Cage understood that Marshall had concepts that Cage could use, but Baudrillard catching up to me when he says Marshall was a musician. Now, after Cage, you can see, yeah, anybody's a musician. That's what Cage said. Anything is music.
Well,
But-
yeah, Frank.
But you know what? He was wrong.
No, no, no. He
Cage?
wasn't saying it
Yeah.
wasn't. It wasn't in the sense of you have to lay aside all aesthetic judgment. It's that anything can be organized in the same form as music. In other words, a composer organizes certain events to take place in a certain time frame, and that's a composition. And what I think
Yeah,
what
but
this
that
theory
doesn't make
was.
it music.
No, but the theory of structuring something so that it affects you in the same sense that a musical composition does can be done with all kinds of other forms. And I got that from Frank. I guess he got it secondhand from Cage, and Cage got it from who knows where. But it was, yeah,
Well, Cage
anything
spent a
can
lot
be
of
done.
time with McLuhan in the
That's
early
probably where
60s.
Cage got it.
Yeah, he was working out Bucky Fuller, Cage, and his Suzuki. Those three guys, McLuhan, Fuller, and Suzuki, were what he was trying to figure out. What was music as an institution?
What is music? Right?
Yeah,
Question
yeah,
mark. Right.
yeah.
Well, it's a
So-
lot of
Well,
things.
Suzuki, we know, didn't have the answer.
Right, now, it's in this,
No, but it's-
Cage may have been wrong, but that's not what I'm leading to. The
Yeah.
point is that Baudrillard sees Marshall as a musician. And then my concept is, which I have in my book, is that I say Marshall was a satellite conductor. Because when the satellite environment went up, well, not the world government, but the solar government, or NASA, or the National Security State, could organize the globe and the media and what was going on in the forms and the content. So the world government was floating around the planet via satellite, a global surveillance. Now, Frank was very intuitive. I say he's a satellite conductor, and that's one of the major motifs of his work. Because what does he do in 1962 when he gets 63, 64 when he gets Studio Z? He builds a rocket. He's inside a rocket ship.
Yeah.
Okay, and all that. That's Captain Beefheart.
Yeah, the grunt people. That was those old sets.
Which was
Yeah.
based on Billy Sweeney Agonist. Billy Sweeney. And Billy Sweeney was the first beginning of something about Captain Beefheart. Captain Beefheart versus Grunt People.
Right.
So he merges those two concepts. It's a guy wanting to get to the moon. Now, you take that point, you get all those concentration moon, you get Huntington, which takes place on the moon, but it all goes back to space and rocket travel. And that's 5 years after Sputnik in 62, 63. He, Telstar was out in 62. So he's always absorbing the
Well, and
present.
also, go back far enough with Frank, too, what was he interested in as a kid was chemical experiments that blew
Rocket
things up.
blow things up,
rocket
yeah,
fuel.
right.
How can you make rocket fuel out of, like, household ammonia and whatever you have?
Right. So I then developed this theory that Frank was a satellite conductor, and not just a musician, and working with all media and all forms of art and making and artifacts. And that's why he was a scientist, he pretended he was the evil scientist, imitating, the satellite is like the Antichrist, floating around the planet with this sword, Damoclean sword of nuclear war and Armageddon. Frank I can maybe unconsciously see he intuited this, because he was that kind of genius.
All his role models, too, if you think about it. His father was a good and a bad role model, but a
Yeah.
role model, a strong one. Varese, obviously, the mad scientist. He said, when he first saw EMS 401, he said, the Varese album, he said, I thought at first somebody made a record of a mad scientist, and I thought it was great that someone had made a record of a mad scientist.
Because he was a scientist as a kid.
Sure.
And
and science was, see, Frank, I'll tell you another thing about Frank that goes back to that measurement thing and ratios and
Yeah.
size, scale. He really liked to have absolute quantification of any kind of data that he was working with. He didn't really like
a scientist.
Yeah, he really did have that scientific method firmly entrenched in his thinking.
Now, his father was a great historian of Sicily, and said, on a certain level, the mafia around the world,
Right.
and everything came out of Sicily, and he
Right.
was somehow...
There's some more control there. It's more definite.
Yeah, and he was a historian. He was trying to talk about that. He maybe even told Frank stuff that Frank didn't write about, but Frank honored it in his biography. So
Is this sort of like the Mormon Fund?
The Mormon
I just remembered in this interview with Frank, Life Magazine, Frank says, I work with explosives and electricity. Think of explosives as hardware and electricity as software. The satellite conductor works with hot media and cold media. Hot media are militaristic wars and armaments, and cool media are TV or Madison Abbey and advertising. So advertising is the Esperanto within the solar conductor, satellite conductor situation. And in the end, Frank is always commenting and being advertising. Because the letter in Ben Watson's book, they have a letter, one of the Dot Records guy or somebody says, well, Bill, I just talked to Don Donovan Bleaton and Frank, and he says, of course, if they could take over our company, they would cause a revolution in advertising. This is how they feel. But between you and me, and then he goes on. But the point is that Frank was pitching, him and Don were pitching ideas about how to update their advertising to these advertising executives. It's just little 22-year-olds, you know what I mean? And so the point is, advertising was their metaphor. And Vance Packard and all that stuff, I discussed that in my interview with him.
Right.
So if advertising is the global Esperanto, which is a satire on the content that people read in the newspapers and books and movies, then Frank, taking that position, is going to take content, music, all expression, it's all something he's conducting. So anything, anytime, anywhere, for no reason at all, which is the way they make the fucking news. They go and they make some stuff and they make a now that they put on you at 6 o'clock, the local news. So he's imitating news making. And if you listen to Lumpy Gravy, in the end it doesn't hold together. I mean, you know, you don't, it doesn't
curiously inconsistent piece that started as a ballet or something.
Right, right. It's a page, like a page of Finney's Wink. In the end, you cannot make a linear thing out of it.
None of Frank's music is
Right.
linear in that sense.
But that resonates with the idea that it's music, that the content was not important. He was showing the information blast thrown at people, which is simulated by advertising, and the real point was the invisible and the inaudible satellite conductor who's not available is conducting.
Right, asleep at the switch.
And it's right. And Reagan was the thing that manifested that. The guy is sleeping at the switch.
When I went up to the initial interview with Bizarre Records in January of 1970.
Yeah,
I mean,
2 months before we were there.
Right.
Yeah.
I happened to, we got out of the car, I was dropped off by my dad, my boyfriend was there, and the two of us were dropped off. And we walked through, there's like an alley next to, this was in the Lee Towers on Wilshire Boulevard, the old Bizarre office. It's that big kind of turquoise colored building on Wilshire Boulevard. There was like an alley with a bunch of dumpsters and garbage cans, and somebody had thrown out, I don't know why or why it was there, a broken television screen. Just the screen that had a big crack across it. So I took one look at it. I said, I got to give this to Frank. There's a message in this. And I pulled it out and I presented it to him when we talked to him, and he just cracked up. He thought it was absolutely hilarious.
Well, that's totally right.
And he just sort of put it, he put it like under, he like stuck it up on the desk behind him like it was.
He kept it as a valuable thing.
Because I just sensed, now there's a message in this.
So let me tell you.
Trying to say,
You may not. Okay, you might have. I have evidence. I was just looking at Wally's book, and there's a picture of Frank about 1966. He has that tall hat. He's holding a burnt sandwich with broken radio parts.
Oh, that's the Electric Hero.
That's right. And he's sitting there. And when I looked at that the other day, I said, "That's it. That's burnt weenie sandwich. The radio is broken.
The radio is broken.
The broken machine is the cover of burnt weenie, isn't it? Doesn't it
there's
say?
all kinds of machinery on it.
Yeah, and I think they say.
Uncle Meat too. There is some.
Right, and World for the Money, doesn't he say? Turn your radio around and look at the back of the radio. Remember? Yeah. So he's always trying to get you to look at the form of technology, not the content.
Right.
It's his voice on the radio. You know what I mean? And
well, even the central.
So you just
are talking.
You intuited what Frank was.
When I saw that, this is the thing. I got to take this up.
Yeah.
You seem very.
Even though you're only 16, you just knew that this was a Frank image.
It really was. I mean.
Do you have any idea on that, Jerry? The radio's broken. The broken pieces. But that's what his album was, broken pieces. And because he was showing you, he was so McLuhan. McLuhan said, look at what people that consume movies and TV, but they never look at the technology that's presenting it to them. They don't go behind the radio and look at the parts. And he kept, that motif goes through his work. He's showing the parts, the Electric Hero sandwich.
He really thought people should ask the right questions.
Yeah.
That was, I think, the one message he had consistently.
He had the right questions. But see, that answered, McLuhan's great line was, that 20th century man is running down the street screaming, I've got all the answers, but what are the questions? And that's due to information overload. There's millions of answers out there, but what are the questions? And Marshall said, we have the questions. Well, Zappa felt in his context that he had the questions. Because everybody else thought they had
That was,
the
I think, the thing with the 60s, too. Frank being such a creature of the 60s and coming up at that time and having his thinking formed by that. Because I think everybody was starting to think about really what questions should we be asking?
No, that was an effect. Now here's the, McLuhan said, to look at the form of the media was an effect of the satellite. Now Frank was like the leading edge of the metaphor of doing that, looking at the form of the media.
Well, he's not like Varese in that sense too. He died really before the technology could catch up to what he wanted to do.
Right. But he did achieve a lot with the technology he had. See, that's the thing. Now So you don't have any trouble with this idea of him being a satellite conductor. That seems to fit. And I have to go through all the stuff, but you can see the motif all the way through it. But can you remember him in that context saying anything to you in '72 about something that approximates that kind of idea? Well, you definitely picked up the multidimensionality, which is different media.
Yeah, watching him working in the studio, you got distinctly the feeling that he felt that everything, you know, in terms of the universe that he was imposing himself on, you know, was definitely a very random thing, and he was the organizing principle around everything everything had to evolve, and that was, I think, why he took such a.
Oh, now you bring up did you see the Billy's Voice article a couple of months ago?
Yeah,
Walley, because they praised Walley's book,
Yeah.
but interprets Frank as a control freak and misses the whole point.
Yeah.
Because a satellite conductor allows the humans
To randomize, you mean, is what you're saying.
Well, here's what McLuhan said. He used Bucky Fuller's Spaceship Earth idea. And he said, on Spaceship Earth, there are no passengers, only crew. Because the electric media by the 60s, the Warhol thing, everybody becomes famous for 15 minutes, is everybody gets on there and says content. The content sort of standards went down low because they had to have so much content for the 24-hour cycle of TV programming. It's now peaked with the talk shows. Okay, anybody can get on. But the point is, everybody helps create the information illusion and his content for it. Now, I think that's what Frank was talking about. So the satellite conductor allows the public to be actors in the global theater and be content, but it knows that the form is more important. You just keep the TV environment on, the electricity going, and it seduces everybody on some level and destroys the society. And Walley has the quote that Frank said, we got government corruption, TV is a big, he lists out about 5 things, and television is one of them. So the satellite conductor, he is a fascist, a Nazi. Big Brother is part of his apparatus, but he allows the people to run amok and create their own myths as content. That is the subtlety of Frank as a satellite conductor, because his musicians had room to improvise, but they had to include the controlling factor of him. So he wasn't, the control freak is only half of his self. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Although, you know, with work that he was doing, he did exert a tremendous amount of control. You know, it almost was enough.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I didn't like him.
Oh, Lionel's,
was the way he.
When Lionel first saw him conducting a rehearsal.
Because
he said this guy's like a fucking football coach.
Yeah, and that's what Tony Murray said. You're in the military.
Yeah.
And yes, sir. What do we do next? Yes. Well, this is the point.
And I was used to, you know, chamber music where people respect each other.
Right.
And the music is always a dialogue between different.
I did make the point though that if you go to a rehearsal in an orchestra by a conductor is often quite a drill sergeant. You've got to be. Chamber music is usually people who know each other playing material that requires a high level of communication, interpersonal communication. If you're conducting a symphony orchestra, you've got 60 people out there, and you're just this little, you know, pin dot with a white stick.
No, I mean it depends
and you do have to,
conductor.
you do have to keep them in line. It's just part of the reality.
Although I'd never seen.
There's
for
not
example,
room for
if anybody in the LA
There's
film,
not room for individual interpretation.
If people had been,
the conductor has to.
Most of the musicians I knew in the LA film, if they'd been treated the way Frank treated his musicians.
Well, actually, Zubin did.
Nobody respected.
Nobody respected him. That's true. Actually,
Frank would not have been able to do it with the normal classical people.
No, because you have to respect your musicians, and they have to.
What he was better with was when he could deal with people on more of a one-to-one basis. You know, individually, like individual members of the group. One thing, now this is something interesting. What I noticed on the '71 tour, his psychology, his ability to get into the minds of all of those guys was just uncanny.
The kids.
Never saw anything
This is
like
the
that.
playground psychotics. He knew he had.
Boy, that is so, you know. Close
Well, you point that out in your book a lot.
Yeah.
Talking about his audience right now?
No, the musicians that worked for him.
He had these young kids who had to do, but they're out there getting laid, they're getting drunk, they're doing drugs, and they're getting sick.
But he knew, you know, he knew all their motivations.
Yes.
In fact, he time after time he would say, well, you know, I can tell you, Mark Woolman's going to do this, and 5 minutes later he would do it. I mean, that just.
He was like, you got the actual.
Yeah. He was
you were
like,
the little spy who could hear what he had someone to talk to on the side.
Yeah. See, he figured I was not going to, you know, get him in any trouble.
Yeah.
And then later his mind changed about that because he realized that I was more intelligent, I think, than he originally thought.
Frank worked with 30 musicians Ensemble Moderne and treated them like humans, and it's documented on film, his interaction with them. And
but see, let's go back to
when Sound of the Fury comes out, it'll prove it, you know, how well he worked with them.
Maybe he changed.
He did change.
Yeah,
I think.
well, that's when he's on his way out.
Yeah. Okay, but it's he.
Yeah, and maybe he was working, I don't know, with the Ensemble Moderne was, but were they?
They were good
sharper
musicians, terrific musicians. I'm sure he didn't
They're
have
the
to
best
kick
in the
their
world.
lessons.
They're Stockhausen's house band.
Well, I don't know if that's
I want you to
right.
hear it.
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't, that was, I made that point to Lionel once. I said too, you know, a lot of the guys that he was dealing with at different times with some of the bands, you know, that was the only thing they really understood. Frank wasn't, you know, he had certainly had asshole tendencies, but that wasn't the whole story with him. He knew what he needed to do to get the performances he wanted out of those particular musicians, and if he had to write and run them, that's what he did. Now with these guys in the Ensemble Moderne, that wasn't necessary.
Yeah, because they were so.
They were able to probably intuit what he wanted, and he didn't have to point the finger or push them around.
They
wanted
wanted
to play
someone
that
to be challenging.
Yeah.
Okay, let me throw
About
some
climate,
light on this.
climate too.
Mm-hmm.
What?
The word climate,
Yeah,
yeah.
you remember that.
How about the?
No, I'm gonna
no,
explain.
I was going to say, how about the problem of the starving multitudes?
Say it again.
The problem of the starving multitudes.
You're asking me about how did Frank deal with that?
No.
What was he doing? What's God saying?
Scott.
Yeah, God is talking about the problem of the starving multitude.
Oh yeah, God is asking this question.
You're bringing on another topic, but
Yeah.
before we
I
get
think
to
it's
that-
Lionel rather than God. But, yeah.
But let me explain
'Cause
why.
God doesn't care about
See,
the
you
story.
guys, you know, what she's trying to say is right, but you don't know. Here's the point: 200 Motels is all about the satellite conductor. Here is a guy dressed up as Frank Zappa, Ringo Starr. He's Larry the Dwarf, and you can. The excerpt is in Ben Marston's book. He comes on and he talks about organizing society like a satellite conductor. The human, it's implied in World for the Money, the human recreational facility for the concentration
Right,
camp.
right.
And then that's developed from World for Money into the script of Larry the Dwarf. And he goes through an elaborate thing about, the basic question is, should one use popular music to make money or produce classical quality music? The whole question of what a talented musician or composer, should he work in pop culture or the old? And I wish I had the quote, but you look it up in Ben's book. He describes the dilemma of whether I should be hard on the musicians or not, or who is a better musician to work with. And now in a documentary Jerry had, the editor, or maybe it's Van Carlson, shows the excerpt from 200 Hotels where Frank is saying, and these musicians, they hate working, and blah, blah, blah. And he's showing these guys gripping. And in this interview in Life magazine, he just come back from making 200 Motels, and he talks about how these people hated working for him. Now, he was totally aware of it, but that was part of the joke. He represented the takeover of rock versus the old print, Finnegan's Wake, book-oriented kind of classical musicians, pre-World War II culture, and he's rock and roll, and he's making fun of these people through the image of Larry the Dwarf. And then there's Bickle. You know who Theodore Bickle is? His father. He's the military guy with the briefcase, Jerry. You know what I mean? With the hamburger. And then you think of what he said in Time magazine, the Captain Beefheart and the Grunt people, when he quit the band, when he broke the band up, October 69, it's a picture of him and Gail, he says that it opens up in a concentration camp, the bottom of Grand Canyon. And everybody, the hippies, including the mothers, are brought together in the concentration camp, and they're forced to learn to hear lectures on the verities of the American hamburger. Think of Bickel with the hamburger, and he's military. You know what I mean? He's Mr. Francis Vincent Zappa. And then Frank says, the name of their crime is carved on their back
from Kafka, yeah.
From Kafka, which was referred to back in World for Money, and this is two years later. And then he says, in the end, the monsters come, and Mothra and King Kong, and they save the hippies. But there's an Armageddon, and after the Armageddon, it's found that the concentration camp, or working in Frank Zappa's band, okay, is the metaphor, is run by a little electric doll in the glove compartment of a Volkswagen bus disguised as a Chicken Delight truck. Look, there's your little dwarf and the plastic robot, and that's on the cover of the Uncle Meat car, which is on the back of the Uncle Meat booklet, going through the valley, and all the mothers are running from this big thing, which is attacking the Vatican, right? And on the hood where the little ornament is a little doll pointing forward. See these images, but see that's Frank, totally aware that he is putting on the electric culture. He says, I'm going to use the weapons of society, which is TV, against itself. So he has to be. He has a purpose, a military operation. So he's a commander, and he doesn't mind putting being rough on the musicians and making them be humiliated, the classical guys, because these guys got to be aware of how obsolete music is in relation to the new situation. And then he has the modern musicians and all the problems they go through. But the thing is in the Globe and Mail article, he's talking about his father is a guy laid off, pissed off at what the evil work he did with the government, and he can't do it anymore. And then Frank says he falls asleep and he dreams some dream. Now, I can't remember that, but that's your dream thing. It's about him dreaming. So the satellite conductor, the little electric doll, which is what the satellite conductor is being both hard cop and soft cop. So Nigey's right to intuit that there was more of a, he didn't care about the musicians and being nice to them. They had a job to do, and that was just going to be a bunch of sound bites for the larger composition. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
His
view of it was.
Well, and that's why I find his music unlistenable, and I guess I enjoy it when a group of good musicians are playing well something that I like.
But see, you come from, a cultural situation with me. You have that in your genes or whatever. That's your particular form of music. Frank is an anarchist in relation to that.
What I was going to say is Frank all his life, when he was younger, in his formative years, you had an advantage over Frank. And I think the reason Frank liked you, whereas you didn't like Frank, but I think the reason Frank liked you is he sensed that you had an advantage that he hadn't.
Well, you lived.
Because you grew up listening to, the great music of the age played by the greatest musicians of the age. He didn't have that. He had to go to the library and get a Barres record or whatever. And he had to form his own conclusions. I think there was a big part of him that really did cherish, oddly enough, that 19th century
That's right.
ethic.
The present-day composer, which was obsolete, refused to die.
He loved that. He just loved the futility of that, in a sense.
And that was the question posed by Larry Dwarf. How do you do music in a situation where it's good? It's Don Preston saying, well, if you put the sock over here, it's commercial. But if you put it over here, it's not commercial. It's so beautiful. You know what I mean?
Yeah, sure.
And Frank told him to say that. Frank knew exactly what the dilemma was. You couldn't be a musician. That's why he didn't need to study music and all that stuff. The point was he was a TV camera, an electric doll, playing with the content of the media, which was was metaphorically music to him. So he was post John Cage. He developed beyond John Cage. He actually made great music in the process, on the content level. He told you what?
He told me a funny story. I guess he read in one of John Cage's books about how Cage was visiting his mother.
Okay, he's reading a story
he told me
by Cage.
Yeah, Cage wrote a book. I think it was called A Year from Monday.
Yeah, I have that, yeah.
And there's a story in there which Frank paraphrased to me, and I may be getting this wrong because it's like fourth hand at this point, but something about Cage was visiting his mother and the radio was on. It was some horrible shit. Cage was listening to it with, perfectly obliviously. He didn't mind it at all. His mother came in and, I know what it was. He corrected his mother. His mother was listening to some shit and said, hey, why don't you turn this stuff off? It's horrible. It's like, dance band music or something. His mother kind of looked at him, The gist of it was, he said, his mother said, well, hey, I'm not fussy about music. And then she looked at John Cage and said, you're not fussy about music either.
Oh, she said that to Cage?
Yeah, right. That was the punchline.
Now, why do you think Frank thought
Frank
that
liked
significant?
that. He liked that story, I think.
Because he wasn't fussy about music, really?
Because in a certain sense, he was saying that about himself.
There's a great metaphor.
Because what this came up from was, I asked him about doo-wop. I said, why do you like that stuff?
Now, that was mystery free. Why do you like country music? And you're saying, why do you like doo-wop?
He says, why do you like fucking Spade Cooley? And I said, well, why do you like,
doo-wop?
The Velvets, And he said, well, it doesn't matter. I was programmed at a very early age, and my whole metabolism just responds to that in a positive way.
He was programmed by it.
And then he told the story about John Cage.
Okay,
not fussy about music.
Because that's really important. You have the mother, talking to the son, the musician.
The composer.
And that's the question.
Yeah.
The mother says, you're complaining about me listening to crap music, but she's saying music's irrelevant anymore. You don't even deal with music.
Right, you're not, exactly.
Now that would be meaningful for Frank because he's the mother of invention.
The mother,
Yeah, he's the mother, and he's both, I say he's both the mother and Cage, redoing that question that Cage pointed out. I mean, it's a story that Cage illustrated. And then Frank sees he's even more detached from music than Cage.
Yeah.
And so he's not fussy.
He was a generation after Cage, because Cage was sort of like a mentor.
That's right. Yeah, Cage is going through the Dendy crisis that Perez and them all went through of what's going to happen to music. Frank has already been... Nobody was programmed by music like the 50s kids before that. You know what I mean?
That was the first generation.
Yeah, that was a robotoid. Because they had all this youth stuff in their brains that they couldn't help but liking because you're programmed.
Because it started becoming an industry.
Right. Which was what Frank said when he did his Perez special. He says, you people in the music industry ignored this fucker, blah, blah, blah. He talked about the industry. But see, that's the whole Uncle Meat scenario of using sounds to make plants grow or make people move their bowels. That's Uncle Meat.
The practical side of it,
Yeah, which I think is even in that Life magazine. There's little fragments about that. But that is using media or music as a programmer.
Right. Well, he was absolutely amused by the fact that they had developed. It wasn't Urquhart, because there wasn't Urquhart. In France, early synthesis. This was.
Yeah.
They developed electronic devices that could generate frequencies and make you loosen your bowels.
That's what he was.
He thought that was great. He just was cracking up.
But see, that's satellite conductor stuff.
Yeah.
That's intelligence agency. That's being a scientist in the laboratory.
It's like then the side of Frank too. This I think he picked up from his dad. You know, hey kid, if you're going out in the world, get a practical skill.
Yeah. And he went into advertising.
Advertising, or in a certain sense, you know, he didn't maybe make the vegetables grow, but
No, yeah, but he worked in advertising as a kid when he first jobs. Now
but in a funny way, see, that's metaphysics. It's not practical at all.
advertising?
No, not advertising. I mean, I'm thinking more of the physical manifestations of audio sort of stimuli.
It's metaphysical to think about it?
Because he could think about it, he'd been listening to this doo-wop stuff, you know, and whatever, and realizing, hey, this motivated me. Or when he listened to those blues records and he heard, you know, Guitar Slim and Johnny Guitar Watson, and hey, these guys are like, you know, they're creating a visceral reaction to me and making me feel things, which makes me in turn want to go buy records. Therefore, when I get up there and I have a band of my own, I can therefore turn this onto this audience and get the audience to do whatever the hell I want them to do.
Yeah,
Now, what's the
creative
I'm curious about the word about
creative
metaphysical.
mass foul movement.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, right. The Illinois Anima Bandit. Okay,
Right.
it's right there.
He loved that. He loved that.
But the point is, what are you saying about metaphysical? That's
Well,
important.
the metaphysics is taking something which seems kind of trivial on the face of it, which is, okay, music.
The doo-wop music, Room and the
at
Jets.
its lowest level.
Room and the Jets,
Right.
okay.
Doo-wop is dross. You know, that's
Yeah.
why I read it. Okay, maybe Frank would kick my butt if he were here, but, you know, dross. But he's turning dross into gold. He's transmuting
Through
it
the idea.
Through the idea.
Okay, no, that's where the idea is more important. Now, Miles interviewed the first time the idea notion was in '69 when Miles did one of his great interviews, and he says, "What's the idea behind?" And he capitalized it.
yeah, right.
Do you remember that interview? Were you reading it at the time?
Yeah, I read it.
Yeah,
I read it.
idea. And Frank avoided the question,
sure.
and he went into archetypes of R&B.
You know why though? Because idea, especially the big letters and the sense of it as the big concept, he wanted to be more specific, and you can't be specific with something that large. It's that thing again.
Frank wanted to be more specific?
Yeah, Frank, I think he couldn't deal with an idea that large in that context. I think that's
Right. In other words, either he didn't want to tell the person, like Tommy Mars. Remind me, Tommy Mars relates to that. His story. He had a big idea,
And it was an
but he
artifact.
couldn't communicate it. It could only be done through theater,
Right.
the theater of what he created,
Right.
you know. And so he could be, but he didn't want to really
Sometimes
announce that right yet.
Sometimes
If that's what
Frank-
he was doing.
Frank seemed to me to be almost like a mute person who was trying to shout fire in a crowded theater.
Yeah. Which was McLuhan-esque.
Yeah.
My parents are being killed by TV, you know. And McLuhan.
They don't believe it, you know.
Yeah, Lionel, listen, the great joke about McLuhan is he said, I was the one who saw the house burning down, rang the alarm bell, and then was accused of arson.
Starting the fire.
Yeah, and loving TV. That's the level. That's Frank's dilemma, too.
Yeah,
So the
well,
very
you can
good that you...
confuse the medium with a message.
Nigey, what did you see the fire? Are you referring back to television or something other than that?
The fire, I think he just saw a whole media-related malaise that society was suffering.
9 types of industrial pollution.
Yeah,
That's a song in Uncle Me.
yeah, I don't believe.
You know, what are the 9, you know...
He just saw so much that he thought was wrong about just fundamental values that were, you know, not being addressed at all.
He knew people weren't dealing with reality.
Right, exactly.
So
What
it's-
type of values? Personal, social values?
Social values, ethical values, just, you know, political values.
Helping vegetables grow. He thought people cannot grow. This is Don
Yeah,
Preston.
no
Turner.
vegetables.
We must make them grow,
Remember?
grow,
Yeah,
evolve.
yeah. Well, I mean, what was colony vegetable?
Yeah,
Well,
that's
you
what.
call it
Yeah,
vegetable.
tell
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
No, we made a great breakthrough. I don't know if we go in. Let's finish this idea, but the training film.
That's exactly what I wrote down
Oh, okay.
2 minutes
Yeah, you
ago.
read mine, right? And now here's this training film is what we're leading up to. But back to this thing is that he could not express the idea in any medium because from the satellite position, it's the mixed corporate media interacting. That Jacques Ellul said, propaganda is not the messages of the culture, it's a culture in action. So you got the 9 types of industrial pollution as media bombarding people. The satellite saying, this is great, nobody can bother me, I just keep them distracted with the the snow and mirrors, you know, with smoke and mirrors. Remember Frank smoke rings?
Yeah.
Kurt constantly makes smoke rings, you know? and so the mixed media, that's why any verbal in Walley, he says, any visual means in consciousness of God, you know that great quote in Walley's book? Any form of expression, including awareness of the audience's consciousness, the consciousness of God, blah, blah, anything goes into the pot, into the dangerous kitchen. And he's not just talking musical contents, anything. So if someone asks him a question, he's got to speak verbally, which is only one medium, 1/10 of the soup. So he couldn't say it. Or he didn't know how to say it. He didn't know McLuhan was saying it. And he didn't know how Finnegans Wake had said it. But he knew that's what he was trying to express. And maybe that's why he was mute. He didn't know how to say it.
Right, there was, well, it's the same thing I think we said earlier. You're dealing with something that has so many dimensions. If you talk about one dimension,
which is the pot.
Right, the stew pot or whatever. You know, you talk about one dimension, it's not correct.
Right, and have you seen P. Fiacca? You're right. If it's not one, if it's just one dimension, not the whole story, then it can't be communicated. He once said, he got a point across.
I was trying to tell somebody. He said once, he made one comment to me. He said, you know, sometimes talking to people, it's like trying to explain Zen. And
You can't do it. And you just said the very same thing. What I was going to say, he once said something, and the person got it. And he says, well, why don't you tell more people that? And he says, it would take too long to explain verbally, use one medium. You'd have to write a Finnegans Wake, you know, 700, 600 pages. So, but that's another version of, it's not the cultural Zen phenomenon. He had a new insight, which was post-Zen, but he's like trying to say a Zen thing. And
I think he thought, for example, television or popular music, or films, whatever, those, you know, popular forms, were leading people away from, in essence, what
the old-fashioned part, and also the true fine culture. That's the 19th century nostalgia part.
Well, that was, I mean, he really picked up, I mean, as a fan of Webern, you know, Webern was trying to solve, you know, in the early 20th century, all of the problems of the 19th century.
Right.
In a sense, which he was teaching, he went on because Schoenberg started that process, kicking out the Wagnerian jam, so to speak, you know. And, you know, in a sense, Webern, I think, and Frank, I think, I can say this for Frank, because he said this to me, he thought Webern was the most successful of that group. In solving
that includes
those.
Perez?
No, Perez was a separate.
Right. He actually was dealing with the, Webern solved the obsolete problem.
Right, exactly. That was his
so he felt that Webern solved the problem.
The 19th century.
Right, and he told you all this. You know, this is.
Well, we listen to music, you see,
and then he talked about. He was educating you.
He figured, you know, the musical knowledge was something I could use. It was
so you
one dimension at least.
Right, you had not listened to classical in that way.
Not the stuff that he listened to.
And you're only 17, You knew of it.
Yeah.
You knew of it. You heard the Rite of Spring and all that.
Sure.
But he put you through a little instant school.
Right, and it was his, you know, the music that he loved, which was made it valid for me.
But he had a system. He said, well, Webern takes us up so far, then Perez takes us into the world.
Well, he started with Stravinsky.
Right.
Because Stravinsky, he thought, was still very much in the 19th century ethic. I've been criticized, actually, for describing Stravinsky as essentially and intrinsically a 19th century composer. Well, he is. He was dealing very much with the 19th century concept of things. Webern was one step beyond because he kind of put the 19th century later to rest.
Right.
And this is Frank's view. And then,
Perez dealt with the new problem, but he didn't have the technology to deal with it.
He kicked the bucket, and Frank was frustrated. He died. You know,
yeah, we could have had more material, more
if he only
information.
been encouraged more, you see, he could have gotten the word out. You know.
It's just like Joyce died, so he never lived to talk about Finnegans Wake. That's frustrating to Joyce scholars, you know.
Yeah.
So
Do you think he would have talked about Finnegans Wake?
Probably not.
He did with me through the medium. You used to hear that tape. But that's a good question. The living Joyce, would he have, what would he say?
Yeah, it's the same problem Frank had.
Yeah, he might have, that's why Frank redid and he explained Finnegans Wake with the latest new technology, which is what Finnegans Wake was about. It's a book about the effect of radio.
Is that something
you
you
get that?
think?
Effect of radio.
Absolutely. Now, do you think that this is something, actually, Jarry got into that too?
Well, Jarry is key. McLuhan writes, he talks about Jarry and Joyce, he puts them together, which you might want to look into.
John Vander does. My friend has written about a 2,000-page manuscript on that.
Oh, well, I know John. He's in my group.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's
his fetish. I mean, that's his obsession.
We discovered that became aware of his dealing with that in the spring of '95, right around the time that I then got your book. You know, so you and John go together at the same time.
Yeah, I've known John about 10 years actually.
Yeah. But anyways, we're getting off. Perez.
Oh yeah, okay. But what I was going to ask you, and this is, I think, would it be? Do you think it's possible that, say, Finnegans Wake was 1939, and then Frank came along and did his thing in the 60s, 70s, 80s, whatever, 90s? Now, do you think that this multidimensionality will be recapitulated periodically by people, and if so, how are they going to do it?
I'm the one doing that. Now,
You're doing it
as
now,
a
so
musician, I'm
uh-huh.
solving that problem.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, you should see my chart.
So now are you adding
I'm standing on
you're-
Frank's shoulders.
Right, so you're adding new dimensions to the dimensionality already.
Well, and also bring us back to the basics. I found a way to bring us back to
Mhm.
basics thanks to Connie.
Mhm.
And yeah, no, that's what I'm working on.
Mhm.
You know, as a musician, I'm composing something that my manifesto explains. So you have Finnegan's Wake, then you have Zappa, and then you have me standing on the shoulders. So, but that's a whole other, that's all, man, that's another issue. You'd have to interview me on that one after you read the papers. But I'm telling you how I regard Frank, which is preparing you to understand what I said, what I think. But yeah, Frank, what are the people going to do?
How
The
are
question is
people
going to get
respond
past
to
Frank.
this? Right.
You know what I mean? Because he wrapped it up. But he was a retrieval of how Finnegan's Wake wrapped it up. And TV wraps it up because that's the last medium because it's multidimensional. Now the computer and internet is just taking TV and making it one-on-one, you know, customizing.
Yeah, it's
Custom tailoring. All right, now what was the thing?
Training film.
Right, now I think the point is that Frank, Frank stood on Cage's shoulders, you know, and he went beyond Cage. And I always liked, Lee Dulesky wrote a column for Walter Bower's East Village Other, say 1970, and says, why doesn't someone, and she liked Frank, she was a friend of David Walley's, she said, why doesn't someone take on R.D. Laing and John Cage? Now, in retrospect, I would always remember that at the time I read it, but by the middle 70s I was thinking, Frank is doing that. Frank is taking on those guys and pushing it. And he always would be evasive on the Frank thing. I'll remind you of the Tommy Mars. Evasive on the Tommy Cage thing. He was forced in Frankfurt to acknowledge Cage quite relaxed and no equivocations, because Jerry can tell you that he used to always sort of back off on the Cage thing. Say, no, Cage is that, but I'm doing something else.
Yeah.
You know?
He didn't want to look like an imitator.
Yeah, it's like me saying, no, Frank did that, but I'm doing
Yeah.
something past Frank. It's
Right.
the same thing.
Right.
But he did at Frankfurt. Cage had died a month before, I think.
Right.
And he's saying everybody has to bow their head. So there's definitely a Cage thing. And you're giving us the first
Oh, sure.
anecdote of the story he got out of it. And the pun is, it's the mother and Cage. and remember, the cover of Rowan's Money, since Frank is not just a musician, he's actually the housewives looking at the Beatle phenomenon,
Yeah,
but
right.
super conscious housewives, because he's frowning there, these stupid kids are really, he's looking at his parents, who are now, he's looking at American culture, which is like the way he studied. He's a mother, he's a concerned mother, you know what I mean? Motherfucker, you know?
Motherfucker.
Yeah, so now that we go into the training film, but unless you want to add something. Okay. Training film, Jerry?
Yeah.
Here's the
there's-
thing. I listened, you've heard it, the Dave Walley interview.
I've got it.
Yeah, okay. Now that's probably Pamela DeBar who walks in.
That is.
And she goes, Mr. Zappa.
I know, which is what she called him.
And she meant it, you know,
Yeah,
she's
she-
totally respectful. And like she would be, Frank would be 30, no, 31, and she would be, she must be born in 1950, let's say, right? So she's only 20. Yeah, he's 10 years older. You know, there's a Mr. Zappa thing there.
Oh, yeah.
Now that you come around that night and another time?
Yeah, it wasn't necessarily that night, but it was one of the nights that
During the week
Wally
he was there.
interviewing Frank. Yeah.
Like that,
Yeah.
we can assume that is all one night, that tape.
Yeah,
that
I
night.
think it was.
Yeah, because the rumor was that was you coming in, but it was Pam.
No, that was not me.
But you came in later. That is probably, it might have been, see, August 7th, you went to the Poly
Yeah,
Pavilion.
right.
This is August 8th. You go up August 15th. And
Right.
Wally told me in May that it was about between the 15th and 20th
Yeah.
he was up there. And that was your next week. You had to come up the next week.
Yeah, and I came up a couple of different times. I had to pick up some music, and that was how I met Wally. Although
Yeah.
he didn't make that huge an impression on me. I felt very much that he was in Frank's shadow.
Okay, so
Yeah.
listening to what did make much impression on you?
David Walley.
Yeah, he was just
He's
a
sitting
little.
there. He looked sort of like Frank, but he looked like a shadow of Frank. You know,
Yeah.
It's like spectral little.
He was so much a member of the cult. He was a ghost. He
He
was
was
merging
right,
with
yeah.
Frank, which wasn't too cool, right,
Right,
from your
right.
point of view, right?
Yeah, I kind of felt like if he's supposed to be, I mean, later when I thought about it, he's writing a book. I thought, well, what is he, a journalist or something? And I found, no, he's the guy that wrote that horrible book about Frank. And I thought,
That little guy.
yeah, that guy wrote that.
timid
This
guy.
is what all this stinks about him?
Well, maybe Wally was being
He was
subduing
just-
himself.
Well, he was just
Because
sort of-
that's
yeah.
2 years after he's orchestrating Patricia Keneally to have an affair with Morrison and dump Pam. That's in Patricia Keneally. Have you read Patricia Keneally's book? It's in Wally in the late '69 is an ex-lover of, but still friend of Patricia Keneally. Morrison's having an affair with her, Patricia and David and maybe Jim consider Pam stupid. So they have a dinner in the village, and the game is Wally is steering the conversation with Jim to lofty levels that Pamela falters on, so that Patricia looks good because she's literate and she can talk. And Wally, so he's this Machiavellian guy with Jim Morrison 2 years later. So he's purposely laying low.
Yeah.
Also, as Wally told me, at that point, it's his last time with Frank, he's telling Frank, I don't want to do the book, I can't do it.
Yeah.
Because there was something blocking
Yeah,
between
yeah.
him and Frank. And then Frank convinced him to do the book, because Frank needed a book as part of his
Right.
concept, you
Yeah,
know.
sure.
So Wally might have been just
I think
submitting
that's what
himself.
it was,
Yeah, Frank, just tell me what
Yeah.
happened.
Yeah.
So listening to that tape, I then went and looked at the book, and I saw a lot of it is summarized and quoted, but I think this part is not in the book, it's just spelled out, but the dialogue about it is very important. The project was, the first cop comes to the Saints and Sinners and says, okay, there's been some articles in the paper on you, Frank, you've got all this archival material, good studio, we want to make a training film for our police department so that they can handle the perverts they bust, you know what I mean, and get to know them better.
Yeah.
And Frank says, oh great, good idea. And he spells this out on that tape to Wally, a little more detail, and then you realize all his work is about people who do stuff that is not normal. He continues, this is the trauma scene. He's got a gig, you want to say? Oh,
No, go ahead.
He's got a gig. He's going to make an educational film that's going to help the community, because he knows a lot of the perverts just the way his lifestyle is, you know, perverts in quote, and the cops want to have a better understanding of them, so he's going to help them.
Right.
So he'd go around and interview all these guys, and he would do his little perverse twist on that and make it even more perverse, right? So that project turned out to be a hoax. The point was they were just establishing contact with him, then they come and they dump that project and they want to make a porno thing. And then they bust him, they fool him on that.
Right.
But let's go back to he then is in jail and he's saying, those fuckers, I'm not going to do my community service and have a role of having a training thing, which I could get paid for, and it would be a neat thing. And and this is 64, you know, he's been working with Beefheart, you know, and he's got the client. This is a way of infiltrating. It's been sabotaged. So he goes and he says, those guys set me up, and he admits he was naive and he got set up.
Sure.
So that is the question. So then he gets the opportunity to put out Freak Out, and the Freak Out is a replay of the same project. It's an instructional film for Americans to understand freaks and to study all these people, which will help you, if you get into that 184 names, you will understand a bizarre undercurrent of culture that you Americans are not aware of. So Freak Out was an instructional film. And that is repeated all the way through. That's Larry the Dwarf saying, we're going to tell, we've got these musicians at the concentration camp. They're making music, but they're not dealing with the present. We've got these musicians who can do the present, but of course they're just pop culture, which is ugly. So how can the serious scientist or serious composer make you, the audience, understand the situation and also understand people do those things that are not normal? It's repeated.
Think how, also how the whole metaphor of incarceration, of prisons, and
concentration
jails,
moon.
Jails, Joe's Garage,
right.
all of that stuff. Torture never stops. Frank's mind was in a cage, you know, was in a cell.
Yeah. He was talking.
He felt as though, you know, and that even went back before he was in jail, because when he listened to Guitar Slim and Johnny Guitar Watson, he told me that he thought that kind of guitar style sounded like machine gun fire. He thought those guys were like blasting their way out of the ghetto.
Right, they were.
It was like literally.
That's Perez. That's
Yeah.
It's sounds used by Johnny Guitar Watson, the evil scientist. He said he finds the white people or just the citizens like it, and he can make money and get out.
Yeah.
He get the great escape, which is what Billy Sweeney wanted to do. He wanted to get away to the moon. You know what I mean? No, it's the same. It's a very important. Frank says, let's use the weapons of society against itself. That's it. What are the weapons of society, and how can you use them against themselves?
To him, an electric guitar was just a phenomenally strong weapon.
Oh, yeah. And that's why he's better than Finney's Wake. Finney's Wake was the ultimate book, but when you bring in the electric age and electric technology of the 50s, 60s, Johnny ain't going to read. That is the medium, the new apocalyptic form of art and entertainment. It's changing society. the Fugs, you know, we're going to change the music.
Right,
play
when the mode of
society,
music changes, yeah. I quoted that in my book, actually.
Right, so Frank is aware of that, but he also, this is what I said earlier, he knows he had a good ear. He's a great musician. If they could turn off the 20th century and go back to the 19th century, he could be Beethoven. Now that's his natural talent, is his ear, but he knows he can't use it. But it's genetically nostalgic for that period.
Yeah,
you know
he
what I mean?
wishes, you know.
Yeah, but since he can't, he's going to destroy this. Chunga's revenge. You're going to destroy the society with the help of the monster and the little electric doll. You know what I mean? Because if Armageddon happens and they don't, who gets killed? The monsters save the hippies from Armageddon, and there is an Armageddon. But who survived? Either they find the electric doll is dead, or they find the electric doll who set off the nuclear war, which is all California as a metaphor for the fascist takeover, which he experienced before the rest of America did by Reagan.
Right, over the camp in the valley.
Yeah, and the poster of Nixon,
in
1962 or something. He has that. He's always an Abby Hoffman, a Jerry Rubin, and Walter Bower.
There was it struck me too in that Walley interview. He mentions, just very much in passing, he says, then when I came to LA and I went into
this region,
right here, where we're sitting.
Right here, folks, you all fan breaks up, little boys and girls who are loving to hear study this 400 years from now.
If they still have things to play.
Yeah, still to sit on.
If there's still something left to say.
Room of the Jets, check that out, kid. Okay.
But he made that comment about how he went and infiltrated the Fifth Estate. Now, the Fifth Estate was a coffee house up on the Sunset Strip.
Yeah, he says infiltration on the Walley.
That was interesting. See,
that's the father. His father was sending Frank, the little Rumpelstiltskin.
But this, for Frank, was, I think, a big, what he was describing was essentially, very sincerely, too, I think, a big step forward for him intellectually, because he started hanging out with coffee house types and absorbing more abstract philosophy.
Does he say the Fifth Estate on the yeah, because I don't understand what those words are, what they refer to. That's a coffee house in this area.
Yeah, well, it was
the end of
the end of the sort of city college.
That fellow over there.
This guy can tell you all about it.
We'll do that later.
Ran the,
Okay, so you're saying that you just give your theory about what happened in '64, late '64, early '65.
You know, Frank had been in bumfuck out there in Cucamonga. And, you know, in the great inland empire, and there wasn't much culture there. And I think he realized, partly, if he wanted to put his ideas forward to a larger audience, he had to get out of the backlog.
He had to start over again.
Basically, he had to re-educate himself in a political sense.
Right, or in a cultural sense. So you're saying did he get educated at the coffee houses?
Sure. I mean, he
but to fit into his plan.
Well, I think the knowledge was necessary, he thought.
We had to find out what the kids were.
Right.
He was
what
starting
were people thinking?
Yeah.
But I think he got something kind of inadvertently by hanging around with a lot of the people that he did hang around with in the coffee houses. Many of whom, you know, these are people that I've met, and known, and Lionel and Monty here go back to that era.
Well, the Free Press was started at the Xanadu.
And you understand.
In '64.
Yeah,
and
the Free Press was Frank's kind of big you know, diving.
Yeah, and the Free Press, frankly, the reason he probably went to the Fifth Estate is that's where the Free Press officially got going.
What's the Xanadu? That's a coffee shop? The coffee club?
Xanadu was the coffee house of Los Angeles.
And then it went to the Fifth Estate.
That is where the intellectual ferment happened.
You write about this in your book?
Oh, yeah, sort of, and about Munns. And Munns is a whole book, if we ever got rich, we'd publish about all the coffee houses.
Okay, so Frank goes to, so the Free Press started in Xanadu.
Well, the idea evolved at the Xanadu. Basically, there were a bunch of Times rim rats. There was
Gene Beer.
There was Art Landis, who was a communist who wrote about the Spanish Civil War and so.
And then they go to the Fifth Estate, and that's
the
where you
Fifth
actually
Estate,
publish
they're all
it?
sitting around talking about how a newspaper is needed. Art, being not so much an intellectual, but at that point a printer.
And Art Kunkin isn't there yet?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, but you say Art Landis and Art Kunkin?
Yeah, and these were some of the people, but Art was the one who actually did it while everybody else talked about it.
Kunkin or Landis?
Art, Kunkin.
Kunkin, okay.
Okay. And Kunkin, I noticed, I became aware of Zappa. I never went to his music, and I wasn't moved. But I became aware because the Free Press was promoting him a lot.
And that was in '66 when the Mother's album came out.
Well, it's when I know it came out of the Fifth Estate was, you know, Fifth Estate really was quite different. The Xanadu was really a small group of people. Fifth Estate was when it was starting to become a movement, a counterculture.
Okay, and how long does that last?
And the Free Press actually began in the basement of the Fifth Estate, and all the kids would come and sell the paper for a quarter.
And that was in '60. I think I've got Apex book. and he's got the pictures of the various newspapers, and the LA Free Press is the first, and I think that's 64, isn't it?
Yeah, the LA Free Press was 64.
Was it- So when was the Xanadu? That was all 62, I guess.
61, 62.
And the Mutability
63,
was 59?
59, 58.
See, actually, the Xanadu was preceded by a coffee house called the Mutability, which runs also. And they were really kind of a bunch of old lefties, which is sort of funny about Zappa, who has, you know, terrible politics, basically.
From a
I mean,
left point of view, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing he's good on is a certain sense of, you know, could almost be libertarian.
Yeah, he was,
Yeah.
that would be, if you
Which
had
I wouldn't
type-
argue with except in economics.
Yeah.
Okay, so the Fifth Estate is if the LA Free Press is happening in 64, it's coming out of the basement of the Fifth Estate in 64.
But the idea really had evolved before that.
Right. Now here's the thing. Frank shows up. Now we went out to Ontario, got the microphone. We want to find the exact date that he went to jail. He didn't have to tell you that, did he?
Yeah.
Yeah. And Jerry has a great article, September 2064, which I don't know if you've seen. It's an article on Frank in the studio and the film he's making, which is
Right,
called
right.
Captain Beefheart.
Yeah, it was in the Ontario paper. You had it.
Yeah, I have a copy of it in Hot Rats Times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And were you getting that back then?
Yeah,
Last time?
yeah.
Urban Quarter.
Yeah, I
So-
contributed to it, so.
So Frank, before he went up, I listened to Walley tape, and Frank says there've been a couple of articles on me in the local press, so attention was drawn to me. And then I noticed that is quoted in the book. But the point is, we know he got busted after September 2064. So we went through the end of September, October, November, December, January, all the way to May. In the end of May, we did all those months of microfilm and could not find the article. Okay? And then just near the end, the lady who came by and knew what we were doing said, oh, you know, I got a note from the guy they did a little search before we got there. He said, the October issue has missing dates. So it may have happened.
Expunged.
Yeah, it was deleted by Big Brother, you know, that's George Orwell's job. I mean, the character in George Orwell, 1984. Was it
Well,
deleted?
in fairness, having been around newspapers, missing dates can also be
No.
explained by the...
No,
Yeah,
if
no.
it's something like that, probably somebody else had been there and just.
Well,
swiped
you
it.
know what, it was really funny going
No,
there.
it's the microfilm, so they couldn't.
They couldn't
cut-
swipe it?
No, they can't swipe it. It was the
It's a
mistake.
typical rule.
Yeah, oh,
It was the
really just
mistake by
an
whoever
accident.
did the microfilm. He probably worked for Frank's dad.
Yes, and they probably, and the thing is that they didn't have all the papers, you know, they didn't have October 22nd, you know, they just lost it or something, you just didn't have it. So maybe he was busted in 64, because it's very imprecise. You read
Also,
the,
there's usually copies elsewhere, other places. If you
of
look at
microfilm,
other- yeah.
but they're standardized microfilms, you know, they're just
Oh, I
the
see what you're
same
saying.
thing.
Yeah.
So if it was October 64, you know, the actual article, because it's on Rare Meat, you have the article where he's busted, but it doesn't have the date.
There's no date.
Now, did Frank cut it off? It's not, that's, you know, did he not? It's the timeless
There's no
moment.
copies of the
Yeah.
article with the date
When I
because
was,
it's in
I remember in the
10
basement,
years.
he had the two ago go to jail. He had
That's
that
it.
clipping- He had that clipping up on the wall down there.
Yeah, and Walley says in his
Mhm.
book,
Yeah, it was there.
even Michael
Yeah.
Gray, is that Michael Gray, the other one?
Yeah.
He says he celebrates the clipping, it's right
Yeah,
there.
it was there. I didn't look, I never looked at the date. I wish I
If
did.
you ever find a copy with the date,
Okay,
please
well-
tell me.
Jerry, you could have gone, if you ever get back into the house, and you would,
It's
did you ever
probably-
get down to that basement's
different.
gone?
No, I've never seen that article posted.
Oh, again, okay,
Yeah.
yeah, it's all different, because you could have gone
Different
back and
basement.
seen the date.
Yeah.
So here's
If
the
it
point.
indeed is on that copy, there's
Yeah,
still no proof.
the thing is, did he actually, see, here's my, if he consciously cut the date off, then that's the timeless moment, because the point is, all of Frank's work is time, working with the Mobius strip of space.
That's a time he'd like to forget. He'd
No,
like
but
to
it's
wipe
the
it out.
event of the setup that leads to the
It has
training
to-
thing.
And it's 2 years off in his book. Did you already say that?
Oh, yeah,
He-
okay.
He has a lot of mistakes in the book.
Yeah.
Now, that could be on purpose if he's trying to be a Finnegan's Wake and smear time, because if the question is what time is it, then the report on time can never find out what time is it, and we'll have mistakes. So you can constantly put timing mistakes in there.
If you can't really define what time it is.
That's right. He has George Duke, you know, Bebop Tango, who says he
Yeah.
says he creates it, assembles, and then dismembers
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
You know, he's creating the whole process of what Marshall called the nemesis of creativity, challenge and collapse. You know, he's including the collapse process of the failure. He says failure is not a problem.
That's what he always said about Schoenberg. He said Schoenberg was full of shit intrinsically because when he basically was,
Who?
Arnold Schoenberg.
Oh, Schoenberg. Yeah.
Because
It's
we're not getting
Sherborne, which is a
Sherborne.
Toronto name.
It sounds like a, yeah.
Okay,
No,
Schoenberg-
was full of shit because he essentially was so anti-creativity, he created a system to eliminate it. And that disgusted Frank for some reason.
And that's where Lionel's wrong. That Frank was not a control freak. That's his
Well, not in
public-
that sense. No.
Not in that sense, no.
God.
He knew.
He hated-
That's what Tommy Mars. Now, Tommy Mars, what was I going to say? Well, Tommy Mars is a great story. But Tommy Mars said Frank understood that when you work for him, you were supposed to be creative. You give him the ideas.
Right,
Now,
right.
The old grandmothers guys, Don Press and them, they say, he ripped us off. But Tommy
Yeah.
Mars said we were the next generation, and we understood that it was just great to play with this guy, and it was okay that we were getting paid to be creative. Now, in the early years, coming out of the Fifth Estate, they're young guys with egos. They don't know who's the smartest guy, right, or who should be the leader. So then, in retrospect, they, you ripped me off, you know. Now he goes. So the point is, he's busted in '64, late '64. It's vague in the various books. So he comes to here in early '65.
Right.
So the Fifth Estate is going. The LA Press.
65, yeah.
Okay. Now, Frank is infiltrating. He's trying to figure out how to implement the plan. He once said that everything he does was planned 5 years before, and so he started them out in '64. It crystallizes by '69, so he breaks them up, and he starts the next thing.
Right.
So it's interesting to figure out how much is he infiltrating totally. Like a CIA agent going to appropriate. Ralph Gleason accused the mothers of ripping off the street scene.
Yeah.
How much is he going to rip it off for his agenda, or how much is he generally learning? And maybe now here's what he could be learning. If he was naive in '64 when he got busted, he comes into the counter, the underground, and begins to find out about UFOs or Nazis and assassination of Kennedy and all that stuff in the folk culture of the coffee house, which is his education on his naivety. So
Also,
then he would fit it back into his
I
I
think
mean,
what he got-
assassination was...
63.
63.
No, but I'm talking about
I think what Frank got, though, was a
what
real-
you brought up earlier. The JFK thing is what it's Mae Brussel, blah, blah, blah. That's a key grievance of the counterculture.
But I think what he picked up in the coffee houses, too, was the general atmosphere of intellectual ferment. I mean, just
Right.
ideas which he had never encountered anywhere,
Yeah.
in any of the places where he'd lived before. Here were people just sitting around at tables with cups of black coffee, swilling down the coffee, and talking about really big, important ideas that were really affecting people, you know, in a big way at that point.
Right, and that would be, he would then experience all the perverts and freaks in the different worldviews.
Right, he realized, hey, wait a minute, it's like, you know how he loved the movie Freaks?
Yeah,
So much because
yeah.
the freaks were empowering themselves.
Yeah.
I think the coffee house experience for him was something like that. He realized, hey, you know, I may not be this, you know, I don't want to be this hardcore, you know, bullshit intellectual, but I can see how ideas are a liberating factor. They're not just something that sets you apart from society and makes you a loser.
You see, Art was
As-
basically the
as that
business
being
manager
the
of
case
the
in
Prescott
Lancaster,
district of the
Ontario.
Military.
Well, no, what you said, hold that thought. Now, finish your thought.
See, in places like, you know, the Antelope Valley and San Bernardino and
Yeah.
Cucamonga in Ontario, if you had ideas, you were a suspect, you were a freak, you were relegated to the ash can of society.
Right.
Whereas he came up here and he noticed, hey, you know,
You
well,
can- you can live
this
with
is,
them.
hey, this is great, this is an empowering thing. I can take these ideas the way these people have and really make something out of it.
Okay, now let's hold that thought.
Yeah.
What are you saying, Lionel?
Oh, I was just saying, talking about intellectuals, Art has been a business manager of the Prescott paper, the Military.
Yeah.
That was his background.
Right. So and it's Art Kunkin, his great interview with Zappa in the summer of '69, which evokes the Zapp Comics idea and Pauline Oliveri idea. Art Kunkin brought that out.
Yeah, he talked about this.
So here's the thing. I'm seeing a picture of Frank is that he has concepts, and he's out in Cucamonga, and he's always working through the straight media, trying to get in dot
Right.
records and all. He's trying to get knowledge. He doesn't know. He is not in touch. He's so smart and intelligent what he wants to do that he knows if he could just find the right guy, he could sell it and make money.
There just happens to be no counterculture at that point. So
Right.
He's limited.
So here's what happens. He's planning. He's got a studio. He's got an article on him in the newspaper. This is Cucamonga guy. He gets busted, and he admits he's naive.
Right.
His father, Wally quotes, his father says, everybody in the county knew that Detective Willis was this terrible person,
Yeah.
except our family. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Now, which could be a distracting statement by Mr. Frank Zappa Sr., because he knew and he told Willis, wouldn't bust my son and didn't program him and all this stuff.
You never
So,
know.
so Frank, he gets busted, he's naive. He goes through this traumatic reassessment of where he's going. He leaves Cucamonga. I got to get out of here. He's kicked out anyways. He comes here, and then he finds that that he doesn't have to go through the mainstream. There's actually a culture percolating that he could work in and make money within.
Exactly.
That was his discovery.
Yeah.
And then because he has a conceptual continuity, once 65 comes along, he's making Freak Out. He says, "Oh, this is a replay of the police proposition. I'm now going to educate the people. I'm not going to educate the police."
You can do it. You can do it on a much larger level.
Right.
Yeah,
I'm not going to educate the police about the weirdos. I'm now going to educate the American population about the underground, and maybe I'm still educating the evil police mind in every American citizen, which raises the question, who are the brain police?
Right.
Which he hadn't answered by '88 in my interview. So he answers in the dead interview. He goes into it. So he suddenly has his conceptual continuity where he's frozen, as he says, in '66. He said that in Cream Boy Howdy Profile in the middle of 7th Street. Frank Zappa frozen in 1966. Okay? So he's frozen and he's continually replaying the educational problem. It's a mirror image of the bust, the training film that he got busted over. But now he's talking about the kids getting busted on the strip. And he's trying to educate the people. And he knew that he could work on the pop culture level. So he had it down, and he wasn't a fascist, he was working for Lionel's cause. But he knew how to do it. You know what I mean? And he also, you still have to deal with the fact the left has collapsed. I think Frank knew there was something in a pollution level that the left wasn't dealing with. And he was always arguing with Lionel about the issues on that point. So it's open whether his politics are legitimately wrong. You know what I mean?
Well, there were, I listened recently to that WBAI interview that he did, I guess it was maybe a year before he died or whatever.
Would that be Dave Porter?
No, it wasn't even. It was like 1988, that's right. It wasn't.
I don't think I've ever heard that. You got a copy of that?
No,
Okay.
I just heard it. They played it on KPFK when I was driving around and I listened to the whole thing.
Oh,
Who interviewed him?
It's a KPFK interview. It's a Pacifica.
It's Pacifica, but I
on
believe
censorship, and
right,
it's the
politics.
famous Arizona dildo
laws.
You've heard that.
Yeah.
You mean the one that's even on TV, the one with Morgan Fairchild? The panel?
No, it's just a radio interview with Frank, and it's all about censorship.
Okay,
and he
not
brings
by
up
Porter.
the Arizona dildo.
Yeah, he talks about, but because
Which is mentioned in my interview with him.
Right.
Yeah. But
Because-
it's
yeah.
not Porter.
No.
Okay.
because it was still like a young, fairly earnest fellow who did it. Because it was an election year, he was giving all his thoughts about elections and why people don't vote. And it struck me, I remember I even said to Lionel, and we were in the car together, I was listening to this, I said, I always had given Frank very high marks for being politically astute, but having not heard him speak on politics in a number of years, then at this point in my life, listening to him talking about this stuff, I would have to revise my, estimate a little downward. It was a lot of what he was saying about politics seemed quite disingenuous to me. I mean, just so much of what he was saying showed that he.
Can you give me an example?
Well, he didn't really understand the political process at all.
Of the bureaucracy of politics?
Just the whole what drives the political machine seemed to be something that and I was kind of surprised at that actually. He was talking about why people don't vote, and he wasn't addressed. I mean, I'm trying to remember specifics here. One of the things that struck me is he was like saying, well, people don't vote, and it's their fault that horrible things happen because they're not turning out and voting. Well, the truth is, I think a lot of voters feel relatively unempowered, which is why they don't vote. It almost doesn't matter to us.
Well, politics is
irrelevant.
White House is irrelevant.
It is irrelevant.
Now this is a
Actually,
paradox.
it's not irrelevant.
It's not irrelevant.
No, but the situation is really bad.
Believe me, if you get a dough in there, it's going to be a lot worse than the Clinton.
No, but I think what a lot of people feel is since they are not represented, they're not voting out of apathy.
No, it's out of
It's out of
defeating somebody
it's
who's
a certain
worse.
defeatist sense, And I think I remember listening to Frank talking about this stuff and thinking maybe success was not the best thing that ever happened to this guy. Because it removed him.
It
so
removed
much
him, right? That's
from,
the yeah.
From the level.
He was stuck. He got removed in '66, but he didn't. Not really till the '80s, technically.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
He went off the road and kind of went up
He
the Iron
stayed.
Tower.
It's like Jerry used to say to me after I met him in '88 that Frank should go stand in a line.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
just experience daily life a little bit. He never did anything.
He should drive
like
a car.
Yeah.
I read a song about him, the man who never climbed Mount Everest. It was about his lack of kind of being immersed. As zen as he wasn't really in reality.
Well, that's the 19th century part of Frank. See, this is the that relates now. His concept of the satellite conductor was politically astute and all that stuff. He understood that, but he didn't know how to translate it into the local issue. So he then said, well, being a megalomaniac, well, I'll drop down and be an American for a while and run for president. Which
Yeah,
goes back
right.
to '68. You know what I mean? He had an inflated view
It was
of
like,
himself.
it was almost like the Yippies or something.
Yeah, and here's the paradox, is I think that Frank, because he had to put on being an American, because he really was living in virtual reality and since 1970.
He always had that also, don't underestimate that he always had a feeling of being an alien in American society because he was essentially European.
I was just going to say, think of 200 Motels, Larry the Dwarf, Ringo Starr. He's in the hotel, turns on the radio, spills ink.
Yeah,
He's an anthropologist studying, infiltrating the radio, the broken radio.
Popular culture.
And, you know, the radio, and there was a broken radio theme, but I forget now. But so he is an alien, okay? And in 200 Motels he has Larry Dwarf, and when they show, Frank purposely edited the shots of him, he's this cold or weird looking guy. The close-ups of him playing guitar, and he's really like weird looking. You know, what I mean? He looks alien.
Yeah.
And I bet you he knew. Well, he knew it. He knew that those images create that effect, and he did it because that's the general behind Larry the Dwarf, so to speak.
I think
Okay.
that's part of
Now,
what got on my nerves
let's-
about him.
Okay.
What?
What got on your nerves?
Playing with images like that.
Why?
Just did.
Well, see, he's a POB, what Marshall calls a print-oriented bastard. You know, Lionel is a book guy, and he comes out of that great 19th century thing. It's in his tradition. It's not that it's wrong, but it's hard for him and these guys to deal with this AIDS,
images.
military intelligence creating AIDS and bombarding people with Michael Jackson. What were we going to say? Yeah, creating images.
That
No,
alone.
that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. No, creating images. How do you deal with images? And
well, this, Frank's whole problem. Let's stop for a second. I'm getting hoarse. The light is failing.
I'm
and
getting
it's
hungry.
dinner time. I think there's some hungry
And Munn stupidly offered